without further ado, let's get this done. This is going to be a YouTube video where we discuss the more niche options to beat Ishizu Tear. Together with Twitch chat, we have collected a couple of interesting tech cards that people keep asking me over and over and over again what I think of them, and we're going to go through each individual one, talk about what the point of the card is, and whether I think it's good or not, and why. You know, that's what we're doing. First and foremost, I have put Keldo and Madora. So why did I put these here? Because I never hear about these two in the context of countering Ishizu Tear. Because of course they are Ishizu cards themselves. I decided to include these because I believe, or I noticed that one of the most annoying things when playing Ishizu Tear is, especially if you play the mirror match, if you mill these guys for your opponent, it's really hard and becomes really tough to resolve your Tearlaments in the graveyard, right? Because even if you mill like all 3 Tearlaments in a lucky mill, if you activate all 3, they simply chain Madora or Keldo to shuffle all 3 back, and you literally, your turn essentially ends, right? So having these in your graveyard is one of the best interactions in the Ishizu Tear matchup. It's kind of like a Neko main king, right? That if they mill it for you, it becomes really annoying for them. With the difference that, you know, you can like discard these and just have them in your grave and it can still be good, right? If you play an Ishizu deck yourself, but you're not playing Tearlaments, right? That might potentially be a good matchup for you. So I think it's worth noting that these cards counter the deck really well. Imagine activating all 3 against Madora. That's what I'm saying, right? They cannot do that. Even if they mill all 3, they can't use them, which in itself is powerful. Just the existence of a Madora or a Keldo in your grave limits them in their possibilities. They basically have to go like, oh, I'll only activate one of them, and then I have to set up more plays later to trigger the other ones. It just makes it very inconvenient for them, and it counters 1 or 2 of them, which I think is why these cards are actually quite impactful in the Ishizu Tear matchups. And so you can consider just siding these. A similar concept is Neko Main King, which is a card that we've seen it happen already in some feature matches from the new format. I've seen it happen where the idea behind this card obviously is they mill it for you. And it reads, during your opponent's turn, when this card in your possession is sent to your grave by an opponent's card effect, it becomes the end phase of the turn. Of course, because Agido and Kelbeck mill 5 cards from both decks, a Neko Main King from your deck being milled would end their turn immediately. It is also from deck. If they mill this for you, then their turn ends. Doesn't it miss timing? It does not miss timing. It is a when effect, but that does not matter because it's not optional. However, there are 2 big problems with it, I think. The first problem is it's obviously a horrible draw. It's the card you rely on them for resolving it for you, right? Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You have no real control over it. Very often, depending on what deck you play, the Ishizu deck will try to set up an Abyss Dweller anyways before milling your cards. And then Neko Main King, of course, cannot even work under Dweller. And then, once again, I feel like it's kind of weird siding a card that I'm hoping not to draw. I'm hoping for them to mill it. It seems weird to me, but I think the even bigger issue is that, like, it doesn't stop anything, right? If they go for a mill 5 and they mill a couple of their effects, they all still trigger and they all still resolve, so they still make some kind of board. And then we all know how freaking notorious the Ishizu deck is for playing on your turn, right? If they mill Neko Main King for you, the turn ends, but if they have Herald of the Orange Light, Havness, Kelbeck, whatever, they can still play on your turn and set up more stuff. It's like skipping their turn against the deck that can literally play on your turn as well doesn't feel like it's the best thing in the world, especially if you pair it with the incredible amount of variance that comes with playing Neko Main King. So I'm not convinced by Neko Main King, even though I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. I also just don't think it's that great. Another card that I'm hearing a lot about is Dimension Fortress Weapon. Very simple card, very old card. Cards cannot be sent from the deck to the graveyard. No Merly, no Rhino Heart, no Agido, no Kelbeck mills, no Sharon mills. In theory, if you have this card on the field, Ishizu Tear has a hard time playing. Now, that's where the problems start. Having to have this card on the field before they play is like, this card doesn't do anything going second, right? This is a purely going first kind of card. And at that, honestly, I feel like it's a much worse floodgate than just having, I don't know, the trap card, right? On purpose, I didn't include any of the floodgates in this discussion because obviously a freaking Macrocosmos is good. Of course, Dimensional Fissure is good. I don't have to tell you that. And that's why I didn't include any of the trap floodgates, at least the obvious ones. Dimension Fortress Weapon, the only real use I can see for this card would be with Mannequin Cat. With Mannequin Cat, I could see it because you could like play one and then summon it on your opponent's turn. The problem is also you have to protect it and it's not very strong. They can just attack over it and a lot of decks have a problem in stopping that. For Mannequin Cat, it could be possible to play this card, but even then, if you can summon a Dark of Mannequin Cat, you can just summon like End of Anubis or something, and that's just bigger and stronger. So I don't know why you'd play this card. Another card that I've seen some people play is Tackle Crusader. If this card is sent to the grave, you can activate one of these effects. Target one face-up monster your opponent controls, change that target to face-down defense position. Target one face-up spell trap your opponent controls, return that target to the hand. This turn, your opponent cannot activate cards with the same name as the card returned to the hand by this effect. It's like interesting, and at the same time it's underwhelming, because like what it does is not that strong, because all it does is like flip a card face down. They can still fuse with that or whatever. However, you don't rely on this being milled by your opponent. You can also mill this yourself. So I've seen some people play this in Ishizu decks. I've seen some people play this with Vernusils. It's a level 4, so it makes one of the most powerful XYZs in the format, which is Dweller. And then if you detach it from Dweller or Redoer, you can book a monster, which is not bad. And then if your opponent mills it, you get to book a card. If you mill it, you get to book a card. If you discard it, you can book a card. It can even out some floodgates. It can't out Mystic Mine, but it can out other floodgates. So if you're playing an Ishizu deck yourself, this card could be worth considering. In other decks, you'd always rather, for them to mill your stuff, you'd always rather have a Madora or a Keldo, I'm pretty sure. But it's an interesting option. However, not that strong, I believe. Contact C. Of course, we're doing a separate hand trap tier list, but I wanted to include this here because I mean, Ishizu Tear is like the most important deck next format, and I wanted to specifically talk about why this card, because it's not like your usual hand trap. It might even be worth it to repeat the effect, because this card has not seen that much play in a long time. When your opponent normal or special summons a monster, except during the damage step, you can special summon this card from your hand to the opponent's field in defense position. This card's controller cannot Synchro XYZ Link or Fusion Summon unless they use this card as material. I will say one thing right up front. They will remove this card from the field. It is not going to stay there and lock them off for the rest of the turn. That is not going to happen because they can make Asa the Earth Charmer with it, or they can make Dark the Dark Charmer with it and any other Dark. They can make Sprint with it if they have Merly, whatever. That is not what it's here for. It's not going to stay on their field. But what does it do is like if they go for a play that is going to mill a lot of cards, like let's say they go for Kid Kalos summon Merly and then they activate the effect to mill 8 cards from their deck. You can give them Contact C in response to these two. At least I think you can, because it's a when effect, so it can miss timing, which we're going to get into that in a second. Let me just quickly make sure that works. You can special summon a Tearlament from your hand, and if you do, send the target card to the graveyard. I think that does not make it miss timing, because and if you do, I think is at the same time. I think that's simultaneously. Correct me if I'm wrong, chat. Twitch chat is saying it doesn't miss timing on this one, and Twitch chat is always correct. So yes. They go Kid Kalos Merly, mill 8. You chain Contact C, you give them Contact C, and now, no matter what they mill, it does not matter what they mill, they cannot trigger any of it. They cannot trigger any of their Tearlaments in the graveyard, because they can't do anything with them, right? Even if they hit Agido or Kelbeck, they can mill 5 more, but the Contact C is still on the board while that chain is resolving. So, and there's no fusion you can make with Contact C in Tearlaments. You cannot make Aurora, you cannot make Mud Dragon because the Tearlaments are all dark. You cannot make any of the Tearlament fusions, of course. You can't make Dragostopelia. You don't have a legal fusion summon to conduct while Contact C is on the board, right? So you stop them from activating all the Tearlaments in the graveyard in a long chain. And then after that, they will still be able to link it off and keep playing, but you've basically stopped that entire mill sequence of doing anything for them, right? It's not insane, because in the example that I just mentioned, the one with Kid Kalos summon Merly, they would just not activate the tier names, right? So you're not getting rid of the activations that they have per turn, because they would just not activate them. They are actually not even able to activate them. if they can mill more after, they can still trigger the effects that they haven't used yet, right? So it's not like the same as using a Bestial, right? Because using a Bestial on one name, that name is gone for the turn. Even if they mill another Merly, if you've interrupted the Merly with a Bestial, they can't use it. With Contact C is not quite the same, unless you manage to chain it to Tearlaments in the graveyard. However, I don't think there's a way to do that, because that would only be Havness or Shattering. However, with Shattering, I believe this card does miss timing, because Shattering reads, you can special summon this card from your hand, and if you do, send the monster from your hand to the graveyard. That's simultaneously. However, then send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard, which that makes Contact C miss timing. So you cannot use this against Shattering. It doesn't work on Havness, because Havness by default is going to be Chainlink 2 or higher, because it chains to a monster effect. So against Havness, it doesn't work. Against Shattering, it doesn't work. It works against Normal Summon Merely, Chain Contact C, that works, and then whatever they mill cannot trigger. It works against Normal Summon Rhino Heart, activate effect, Chain Contact C, whatever you send cannot trigger. And it works against Kid Kalos Merely, mill 8. And it's going to stop all the things they mill, basically. But I'm not sure how good that is overall. It's an option you can consider, but it's not like insane, I believe. But not bad. Next up, we have Kashira Unicorn, a card that is not really seeing play right now, pretty much at all. Unicorn is kind of like living in the shadows of Fenrir, right? Everyone is like, oh, Fenrir is so powerful. No one is really considering Unicorn. No one is talking about Unicorn, I feel like. At least some people are. That's why it's here. If you control no monsters, you can special summon this card from your hand, same as all the Kashira monsters. You can only use each of the following effects of Kashira Unicorn once per turn. During your main phase, you can add a Kashira spell from your deck to your hand. When this card declares an attack, or if your opponent activates a monster effect, you can look at your opponent's extra deck, and if you do, banish one monster from it face down. This card is interesting to me because lots of people are playing only one Kid Kalos. And if you summon this card against someone who's only playing one Kid Kalos, it's very, very oppressive, right? It's very, very oppressive. If you put this card onto the field, how does Ishizu Tear play if they only play one Kid Kalos? Because all of their deck is monster effects. They cannot start playing without a monster effect. And as soon as they use a monster effect, Kid Kalos is gone. And it's not really going to be able to, like, of course, it's a trigger effect. So it triggers after the monster effect has resolved, of course, like Fenrir, but it's not that easy for Tearlaments to start off with a Tearlament effect in the graveyard that immediately summons Kid Kalos without triggering the Unicorn beforehand. Like, let's say you go normal summon Rhino Heart, activate effect, send a Tearlament. After that resolves, because the Rhino activated, your Tearlament would be Chainlink 1, and then my Unicorn would be Chainlink 2, and then I would be banishing the Kid Kalos from your extra deck before you get to summon it. The only card that gets around it is like Instant Fusion, Branded in High Spirits, or Foolish Burial, or Tearlament's Grief. Those cards get around it. However, in those scenarios, it's still not awful for you because no one plays more than one Rule Kalos or Kaleido Heart. Like, you can just banish that one. Or whatever you feel like. You can banish the Garura, you can banish the Dragostapelia, the Mud Dragon. All of it is annoying. Whatever you take is going to be somewhat annoying. Of course, we have to mention the card that you add with this because you don't really want to play this card without an add target. As of now, the only card you can add with Kashira Unicorn is Kashira Birth, which reads, you can normal summon level 7 monsters without tributing. During your main phase, you can special summon one of your non-XYZ Kashira monsters that is banished during your graveyard. If your opponent activates a spell card or effect and you control a Kashira monster, you can target 3 cards in your opponent's grave, banish them face down. You can only use each effect of Birth once per turn. Now, Birth is not a bad card in itself. It is a break if you don't draw another Kashira card with it. But the cool thing about it is that you can play Unicorn and Fenrir together. And if you draw both, normally that would conflict. But you can just go Kashira Unicorn, add Birth, and then you normal summon Fenrir without tribute. So you get both of them onto the field for free. And also what's cool about it is this card, even if you don't play Fenrir at all, if you just play Unicorn and you add Birth to your hand, you can actually use the Unicorn as link material or whatever, right? And then just summon it back from the graveyard. So the card it adds provides you with a free body as well. I don't think this is bad. I think this is a solid card against Tear. If you go first, of course. Going second, it's a little bit trickier to use because of course they will already have gone through their Kid Kalos probably. However, you will probably still be able to annoy them in some way, shape, or form, right? you can still banish whatever they are trying to make at some point, right? Because the deck is notorious to still fusion summoning on your turn, so you might still be able to grab whatever from their extra deck and get rid of it, like a Kaleido Heart or whatever. I think this card is interesting. One card that I'm going to quickly glance over, it's also a hand trap, but some people have been mentioning this to me as a way to stop the Madora and the Keldo from the graveyard, to disrupt them. Chaos Hunter. And I think Chaos Hunter straight up, I'm not going to talk too long about it. I think this card is awful. I think this card is awful against Ishizu Tear because it doesn't stop anything they are trying to do on their turn, except for the Madora and the Keldo in the graveyard. Everything else still works, and you have to even discard a card for it. And if they have Pearl or Rhino, they just pop it. It's straight up awful. They can just go Kaleido Heart, shuffle it back into the deck if they think it's annoying. If they have Pearl or Rhino, they pop it for free. It's absolutely awful against Ishizu Tear. It's not worth it. If your deck loses to Keldo and Madora, Chaos Hunter is not the answer. Silent Graveyard is the first spell card in the list, and I actually think it's quite the solid option, because what it says is discard a card, effects that activate in the graveyard this turn are negated. The first thing that's worth noting about this card, it's not playable in every single deck because it's a symmetrical effect, it affects both players. But the cool thing about this card, it's a quick play spell card. That means you can use it on your opponent's turn, you can use it on your turn. This makes this card solid for going first and second, because a huge part of the Ishizu strategy is revolving around using stuff in the graveyard on your turn, right? Like Keldo, Madora, send something with Saliak, fuse in the grave, discard something for Herald of the Orange Light, use its effect in the grave, Havness, mill stuff, use it in the grave, Elf, revive Merly, mill 3, use the stuff in the grave. Silent Graveyard stops all of it, and if the rest of your hand is strong, you might actually be able to play through the tier board a lot easier if you resolve a Silent Graveyard. And then going first, the card is obviously insane. Like if you set this card, Ishizu Tear cannot really play. Also, if they happen to have a Havness in hand, and hit good cards with it, you can just chain Silent Graveyard on your first turn as well. It even saves you from their stuff that they sometimes do on your first turn. The only thing that sucks about it, or two things that suck about it, is of course you have to discard. That's bad. 2 cards being gone for that effect is rough. And of course it shuts off your own graveyard effects as well, which is a big problem, because whenever I'm seeing a card that discards, I'm trying to look for ways to kind of get a free discard, right? To discard something that triggers in the graveyard and regains the card advantage that's lost by discarding, like a danger or whatever. And with this card you just can't do it, right? Discarding a danger and then you're negating your own danger, it doesn't work, right? So that's the unfortunate part about Silent Graveyard. I think this card is a specifically decent card in like Runic, because in Runic you can discard a Runic quick play spell for this card. That does not trigger in the graveyard, right? It doesn't trigger in the graveyard. It doesn't matter that you can't activate its effect in the graveyard, because that's not what you're trying to do, but you still get a benefit out of it, right? You're discarding a Runic spell and then you shuffle it into the deck with Fountain. That alone doesn't make Runics like insane against Ishizu Tear, because you very much rely on drawing Silent Graveyard, but it's not a bad interaction. I think the card is solid in Runic decks. However, I don't know how good Runic decks are in general, but that's a story for another name. And then we have Earth Shattering Event. There's an incredible amount of people that mention this card to me, and honestly, I'm not quite sure why. If a card is sent from the deck to the graveyard, target one card in either player's graveyard, shuffle it into the deck. Also, neither player can send cards from the deck to the graveyard for the rest of this turn. In theory, this card sounds cool, right? In theory, you're like, oh, if they mill a Tearlament card, I'm gonna shuffle it back into the deck and then I'm gonna stop them from milling for the rest of the turn. However, I think literally all the people hyping this card up don't quite understand how this works. This is a mandatory card. It's a mandatory trigger effect. So let's say I have this card face up on the field. I went first, I activated it, I passed. My opponent goes normal summon Merly, mill 3. Let's say they mill Agido and a Tearlament. What happens now is Chainlink 1 is going to be Earth Shattering Event because it's mandatory, and then they get to chain the Tearlament and the Agido, so they still get to mill 5 more, and they still get to fuse with the Tearlament, and if they have a Pearl or Rhino, they can just pop your Earth Shattering Event after that. It literally does nothing. It's genuinely, I think, just an awful card that is only hyped because someone thought it was good and didn't really think it through. And the card has been spiking in price even. It's not good. The effect is lingering, yeah, but like the majority of things they need to do has already happened. You stop them from milling for the rest of the turn after they've already milled like 8 cards or whatever. Out of all the cards you could activate as a floodgate going first, because going second, it's just too late. It's simply too late when you go second for this card to be any good. This card is only good going first, and out of all the floodgates going first, Macrocosmos, Dimensional Fissure, Summon Limit, Rivalry, Gozen, whatever, Shadow Imprisoning Mirror, Soul Drain, all those cards, out of all those cards, you want to activate this one? There's no way. There's no way this card is the best in any shape or form. Speaking of a card that's actually good, that's not like, I mean, it's not like a sleeper pick. I've talked about this card before, but like Necro Valley is insane if your deck can play under it. The thing that's specifically strong about Necro Valley that makes it different from Earth Shattering Event in a lot of ways is that it works going first and second against Tearlaments, because if you activate Necro Valley going second, you stop a lot of their interactions on your turn, which, you know, Tearlament is all about interacting on both turns with the graveyard. So this card is genuinely good if your deck can play under it, which the card is very restrictive, very oppressive, so not every deck can function under it, but it is a powerful card. It's a powerful card. You're still gonna have to deal with the board that they make when they go first, right? They still put out monsters with like 2,800, 3,000, 3,500 if they have Pearl Rhino. But if your deck can do that without playing under Necro Valley, then Necro Valley is a pretty strong card, right? As opposed to something like this. Zombie World is another card that I am genuinely surprised as to how many people are mentioning this card in my chat these last couple of days, which is also one of the main reasons why I wanted to make this video, is like how many people are telling me, oh, what do you think about Zombie World? Zombie World is so good against Tearlaments, it stops them from making Kid Kalos. It's like, no, it's good against Flunder, yes, it's good against Flunder, I'm not saying it's not, but it's not good against Tearlaments. It only changes cards in the graveyard to zombies, right? And so what that means is they can still very easily use an Aqua from the hand or the field if they really want to make Kid Kalos. The biggest deal with this card is they can still make all of the other things. They can still make Garura, they can still make Dragostapelia, they can still make all of the other ones pretty much freely. And also if they have Pearl Rhino, oh yeah, not field, it changes field as well. But if you have an Aqua in hand, you still make Kid Kalos. No, it doesn't change the point. But most importantly, if you have Pearl Rhino, you just make Garura and just pop the Zombie World. You just pop the Zombie World and then you make Kid Kalos as your second fusion. Who cares? It's just not a good card. It's a good card in general, but against Tearlaments, it's just not oppressive enough. At very best, it's a little bit annoying, but there's no way it's like the counter to Ishizu Tear. Like a full power Ishizu hand always plays through this card. Another card that I'm confused why this card is being mentioned as often as it is. It's not that often. Transmigration Break. Any cards that would be returned to the deck from the graveyard are removed from play instead. You realize that this card does not stop them from fusing with Tearlaments. It's just as if you were using a Rhino Heart that has been summoned by its own effect, right? You can still fuse with the cards from the graveyard. It still absolutely works. They're just banished instead, which is like, it only matters in the long run, never really in the short term. And if you really want to return something to the deck from hand or field, you still can. Once again, out of all the floodgates that you have available, why would it ever be this one? It does not stop fusing. You can fuse, stop chatting. You can use a Rhino Heart as fusion material. They do not have to return to the deck. You're using the tier monster. It just goes banished instead of to the graveyard. Is it not the same as crowing the fusion effect? No, it's not the same as using DD Crow, because DD Crow removes the Tearlament from the graveyard before the effect resolves. At resolution, the cards need to be in the grave, but it doesn't matter where they go. As you can see with the clear example of Rhino Heart, when it's being revived from the grave, you can still fuse with it. It doesn't matter where they go. You can absolutely still fusion summon under Transmigration Break with the Tearlaments. Yes, you cannot recycle with Madora and Keldo. They go banished instead, but no way this is the best floodgate. Out of all the floodgates available, this card is not the one. Let's get to some cards that are actually not terrible. Transmigration Break, Zombie World, and Earth Shattering Event are kind of just like, it's literally chatting moments of like cards that are genuinely just not good. Vanitys Call is not one of those cards. Now, I'm sure some people don't know what Vanitys Call does. Activate only as Chainlink 4 or higher, pay half your life points, negate the activation and effects of all other cards in the same chain, and destroy them. Now, this card is a card that I have actually played before. I actually brought this card to the 2018 World Championships. I played this card in Altergeist to counter Red Reboot against Goki, because they would go like Ice Soul and chain like a Goki search effect. I would activate a trap card, And if they had Red Reboot, I could go Vanitys Call, negate everything. If they didn't have Reboot, I could also go Vanitys Call, negate everything. It was pretty cool. It's a very cool card that has a decent amount of potential. Now, my problem with it is, it only really works if your opponent gets like really lucky, right? For Chainlink 4, that's a lot of Chainlinks. When they mill 5 cards, they basically have to mill 3 cards that trigger. That's like 2 Tearlaments and another like yugioh or Kelbeck or whatever. I don't think it's consistent enough for them to mill 3 effects every time. You can also add another Chainlink to it where like if they mill like, I don't know, 2 Tearlaments and you really want to negate them, you can like chain a card yourself and then activate Vanitys Call, negate all the stuff. I don't know. It feels a little too high variance. If they simply don't get that lucky, the card is always going to be dead. I'm not convinced by this, especially because it's a trap card and that makes it so it's only good going first, right? And when it's going first, it competes with a lot of other traps. Like, it's not worth it. Especially, I mean, just looking at the last card in the list here, Different Dimension Ground is like, it's just a better card than this, I think. Because like, if you go Different Dimension Ground when you go first, it's not an whatever happens. If they mill 3 and I get to chain it, it's good. Like, the Different Dimension Ground going first is insane. It's just straight up insane, right? Against Ishizu Tear. If they go for the first effect that mills, you just chain it. So you basically get rid of a card in their hand and then you floodgate them for the rest of the turn. It's a pretty sick card, as opposed to, you know, like a Vanitys Call type of situation where you really have to hope for a very specific scenario. What about Soul Drain? I mean, I said it before, I specifically didn't include any of the obviously good floodgates. Like, of course, Soul Drain, Shadow Mirror, Summon Limit, Rivalry, Gozen, Macrocosmos, D-Fissure, of course they're good. It's not a tech card. You're not teching out your deck if you're putting Soul Drain into your deck. Non-fusion area, of course they're good. We know purple cards with the infinity symbol, yes, they're good. Like, yes. I wanted to use these more niche interactions, more niche cards to talk about like what is good and what is bad, because those are like the cards I'm being asked the most about. Of course, a floodgate that floodgates the entire graveyard is strong against Ishizu Tear, but yeah. I think that rounds up this discussion. What this one didn't include was like the more generically good cards, like the hand traps and the board breakers. What about these, right? You know, where's Dimension Shifters? Like, that's in the hand trap discussion. I'm gonna have a hand trap tier list and a board breaker tier list for this format up as well. So you might want to check these out for my opinion on the more generically good hand traps and board breakers. That's what we're going to talk about in another video. But for now, this is it for the more like niche-y techie cards. Maybe there's some stuff here that you weren't aware of before, or there's a card here that you thought was good and now you know better. That was at least the purpose of the video. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye bye everybody.